Welcome. You're in Capgemini's facility. I'm just going to talk to you for a minute or two before we get going, and I know I'm as anxious as you are for the program. How many of you have been to one of our What's Now New Yorks before? All right, we're starting to get some repeat people, and I'm really glad that we've got some new folks as well. This floor and the floor above is Capgemini's kind of hub of innovation here in New York City. The series that you're in here, we actually started out in San Francisco a couple years ago, and now we're hoping to continue it here in New York. So far, so good. So it really counts a lot on you guys being engaged, and let's have some great questions and things like that in the series. So no pressure, but don't screw it up. It's been a good series so far. Okay. Let me just tell you a little bit about Capgemini, what we do here just for a minute. I want you to find me afterwards or one of my colleagues, and we'll talk your ears off on what we do. But what we do here, I'm part of something we call an Applied Innovation Exchange. You see our logos and stuff behind me. What we do is we bring the best of Capgemini and the best even of external ecosystems, startups, academics, things like that, and we rally around our clients' innovation problems. And we do that, or it's really around their business problems, and we do that to try to apply innovation, get them real outcomes, real results, and we do it in an open innovation way. And this is the place that we do it in New York. We've got about 15 of these locations throughout the globe where we work with our global clients on their innovation. But tonight is about all of us learning and engaging, and that's part of why we call it an Applied Innovation Exchange. This is the exchange part. So I hope you enjoy the setting. I hope you enjoy the speaker. And again, if you want to learn more about Capgemini and what we do, please look me up afterwards. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Pete.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks, Capgemini. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent. It's a media company based in San Francisco. And really what we try to do is always find remarkable innovators who are really trying to figure out better ways forward. And we like to open up deep conversations with these folks to wider audiences, people like yourself, sophisticated audiences. And also we do it through video, and including right now, we're doing it live streamed over the web, and we also do edited versions that other people can watch at later times. Capgemini, the partner in this series, is also, they're interested in really kind of different kinds of innovators and different fields. They're a global consulting firm with work all over the world, and they are touching all kinds of different fields. So for them, they were like, hey, we would love to get in touch with all kinds of remarkable innovators in these different fields. And so together we came up with this series, What's Now, which we initiated in San Francisco over 2 years ago, and now we've spread it. It's been so successful that we've spread it now to New York. And the secret of What's Now is that we take somebody who's doing something innovative in a different field every month. We bring them in to talk about what's happening in that space that everyone should really understand and know about. But we also, that's half the piece, is get someone extraordinary, someone doing something really interesting. And today we've got a really interesting person, which we'll get to in a minute. The second piece of the series is that we have a kind of saying around Reinvent, which is nobody's as smart as everybody. And really, for real innovation, you really need innovators from many different backgrounds, different perspectives, not the usual suspects and things, folks that you really don't necessarily think right off the top of your head, oh, wow, that's famous, I've read them on a magazine or something. And so these are invite-only gatherings in which we have seated, which we really, everyone here, has been invited. It's an invite-only thing. Everybody here can invite a guest of someone they think's interesting. We started seating it with interesting people from networks we know in New York. Capgemini's bringing in their folks, and then the speakers over time always bring in who they want to actually speak to as well. And so over time, over the last 2 years in San Francisco, we've created this crazy network, cross-disciplinary network from all these different fields. And the key thing about this is once you've come to one, you can come to another. And you can come in with someone that really you think would get this thing and would really enjoy it. And so with that, we're kind of expanding this network in a big way. Now, that brings us to tonight. Now, a remarkable innovator. So tonight we've got Chris Hughes. And Chris is like not just an innovator, he's like a serial innovator. And you know, there's for a guy at his age, in his mid-30s, to have done as much as he's done and been as innovative as he has is actually quite a remarkable thing. I mean, he was he was one of the co-founders of Facebook, happened to be started with Mark Zuckerberg's roommate back in Harvard. So he had the innovation of that incredible company, which has made a huge impact on our society in so many ways. He then shifted to become a part of the fledgling digital team, essentially helped organize and drive essentially the early online digital political team of Barack Obama, way in the early days of 2008, way before 2008, which of course went into that successful film. And so there's that successful kind of campaign. And so we saw a huge innovation around how to do things online. And of course, we've seen how that has morphed in different ways, and different political characters, including our current president, have kind of built off that. But then he didn't stop there. He said, well, you know, what about if I bought the New Republic in the media field, and what if we tried to rethink how kind of intellectual media that's wrestling with big ideas would be done? And he tried to for 4 years, tried to kind of innovate in that space, and it had a complicated, you could say, tenure there, and we'll kind of maybe discuss some of that later. But the point is, threw himself at that, and now he has thrown himself into an issue that is really a remarkable one. It's essentially, what do we do to kind of deal with this gross inequalities that are happening in the country right now? What are we going to do in terms of economic and social and political policy to figure out how to actually make the society work better, the economy work better for everybody? And so what he's done is he's founded a thing, or co-founded a thing called the Economic Security Project, which is bringing together a network of folks trying to figure this out. And he's come up with a new book, which you all have in your hands, or many of you do, and you certainly will before you walk out of here, Fair Shot. And basically rethinking inequality and how we earn. And so what we're going to basically do is, one of the nice things about this book is it's a fantastic book. I actually finished it this weekend. And what's cool about the book is it actually ties together his life and what he's learned in all the stages I kind of touched on, and weaves it into what has brought him to this idea that we have to do something more fundamental to reshift resources in the society. And he talks about what's called a guaranteed basic income. And so what we should do now is invite Chris up here, because Chris is going to tell his story, make the case for this guaranteed basic income, among other things, and then have a deep conversation with all of you here. So let's welcome Chris up here now.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I got my hands full there. Yeah. Good.
Thanks for having me.
Chris, it is such an honor to have you here, and you've packed the house here. There's folks basically in the back room here. It's being live streamed all over. Let's talk about, I touched on your background just to kind of tease it up here, but I think what's really important about your book is that you really were talking about your life. I was actually quite struck by how much
you seem so shocked.
You opened up your life. I mean, talking about dad
real.
and mom and how you grew up and all these different things.
Thank you.
But why don't you actually talk about what an impression, growing up in North Carolina in kind of relatively modest means. I mean, it seems to be a big factor of what really has made the foundation of what you're thinking here. And I'd just like to tell people about that. I don't think people understand that.
Sure. Well, I can give the cliff notes of my origin story and how I won't give you every single step, but I'll give you a sense. So where to start? So I grew up in this little town called Hickory, North Carolina. It's at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. My parents had lived there, and their families had lived there effectively for forever. My mom was a public school teacher. Her parents had been farmers initially and then mill workers. My dad was a traveling paper salesman, sort of the middle guy between the big industrial paper producers and the little small town printers. And his dad had been the groundskeeper at a local country club. So I was an only child. My parents had me somewhat late in life. And we had a very somewhat predictable, bucolic, middle-class existence. We went to church every single Sunday. On the weekends, we did a lot of housework. We had a garden in the back. My mom cut coupons. It was very middle America, if you will. I ended up getting a scholarship to go to Phillips Andover, this prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts, and then a few years later, financial aid to go to Harvard, and ended up rooming with Mark Zuckerberg. Started Facebook in February of 2004, and the rocket ship took off. And my life changed more dramatically than I certainly could have ever imagined. But the reason that I tell that story is because as Facebook became more and more successful, and particularly after the IPO, I came into a boatload of money that I felt then and continue to feel was generally disproportionate with the work I put in. So, I mean, this is no surprise. It's on the cover. It's on the flap of the book. For 3 years worth of work, I made nearly $500 million. And at first I thought, well, my case is just totally extreme, right? Like, I'm the lucky roommate of Mark Zuckerberg. I worked hard for 3 years, but this isn't happening that often. It's just me. But then over time, particularly over the past 5-6 years, what I've discovered is even though my case might be extreme, it's actually not that uncommon at all. Like, we are minting a generation of not just multimillionaires, but in some cases billionaires at a rate that has never been seen in history before. I mean, income inequality in general right now hasn't been this bad since 1929, but this idea of particularly 20-somethings and 30-somethings going from nothing to very, very wealthy overnight is new. And that, to me, might not be a problem if it weren't that it's happening at the same time that everybody else is having a hard time making ends meet. And I think these things are very much connected. So my husband and I made a commitment to give away the vast majority of our wealth. After Facebook's IPO, I now work on income inequality, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I wrote the book to make the case that sometimes the best solution is the simplest. And we can completely change the trajectory that we're on using cash with no strings attached.
All right, Don, we're going to have a good 90 minutes here of conversation, including with all your folks here. So we'll get to that in a minute here. But let's step through a couple of things. I had some just questions, and I'm sure a lot of people have. So let's just go back to your Facebook period. I'm just going to walk through a few of these things with an insight towards how it might have shaped your own thinking about this issue. Now, it seemed like an extraordinary group of folks, but how extraordinary was it? Was it just, how much did luck play in that, and how much did just kind of an outsized kind of extraordinary kind of abilities? I'm just curious, when you were in that space and looking back on it, how rare was that, or how just lucky was it?
Well, we all got lucky. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg said this was a theme of his speech if you listened to it at Harvard last spring. We also worked hard, and he, by the way, I mean, is still obviously, he's worked hard all the way through, but both of these things can be true, and I think they were both true in our case. Like, in general, we tend to, I think societally, culturally, we tend to think, well, there's some people over here who work very hard and they make a lot of money and, you know, up by the bootstraps kind of mentality, and luck doesn't have anything to do with it. And then there are other people over here who inherit trust funds or who, you know, are in the right place at the right time, lucky roommate of Mark Zuckerberg. These people just get totally lucky. And I think in reality, most people who are successful are somewhere between those two. You know, I mean, Fortune 500 CEOs, almost, I mean, I think it's safe to say all of them work very hard. They also, I think, benefit from big structural things in our economy that have made it easier for corporations to make more money, while the janitors and folks who are working in those buildings are also working very hard, but don't have the same kind of lucky break. So to take it back to the Facebook case and our example, you know, there were so many things that were out of our control in the beginning. There were many, the things that were in our control was to have the idea that build a social network that was based on college campuses, that was somewhat private, that we could build to get people just basically connecting with one another to start. When we launched the website, I mean, 6,000 people signed up at Harvard within 3 weeks, which maybe in 2018 doesn't sound like a lot, but in 2004, it was just for Harvard students. The total undergraduate population at Harvard is about 6,000. So, it just exploded. And it took me a long time to understand, like, this is not how it usually works with startups. You know, you open a little thing, and then, you know, a few people trickle in, then you iterate and revise, and more people trickle in. But I think my point is that when we opened the network, we had the audacity to try a new idea. We also benefited from doing it at an exact moment in history when people were willing to share a little bit of information, when people wanted to connect and were comfortable connecting on the internet with with friends in their college contexts, and at a moment when we could control the growth for the first couple of years in a way to make it sustainable and not have some of the same problems that some of the other early social networks like MySpace or Friendster had. So it was a combination of hard work, luck, and I think most successes are.
One more Facebook question. How motivated was everyone in those early days with making money? I mean,
Not that much.
Well, let's talk about this. I mean, did they need to think, if we really only do it for 3 more years, we'll be billionaires or something?
No.
I mean, so talk about this myth, essentially, that you have to have a system that has that kind of outsized returns, or if you think it's that.
This is a hard thing for people to understand. I think the markets can increasingly get it now, but Facebook was, particularly for Mark, was really a mission from the very beginning. I mean, he would talk about it with like a faith-based zeal almost, to bring everyone, to bring the world together, to connect one another, to make the world more open and connected. Now the mission statement is to bring people closer to one another. But the money was used as a way to make that ambition real. I think Mark talked at times about, well, if it were easy to raise that much capital and to scale Facebook, then there's an argument that it could have been a not-for-profit, because the mission was most important, and the raising of the capital was a means to an end. But it happens that for-profit companies are able to raise massive amounts of capital faster than nonprofit startups, and that amount of capital enables big staffs to continue iterating and adapting, and there was sort of a theory of the case there. But in terms of making bank, like, that was not why Facebook started. That was not the direction of the company. And I don't think Facebook is that. I think that there are many other examples of other companies where the founders have a missionary-like zeal and the commitment. And sometimes I think you almost need to have that if you're going to be able to push through the hard moments, if you're going to really experience that resiliency. Because if it's just about making money, in the hard days when it feels like everything's going to come apart, I mean, I think it's harder to stick with it.
Okay, we're going to step to the next phase here, and this is laying the groundwork for the deeper conversation. Barack Obama's campaign. Again, you were in the very early days of that. There's a politics nobody makes money except on let's say the people in those companies, in those campaigns are barely squeaking it out. I mean, from what I understand, at least the folks on the bottom. They're in there for something different. I'm just curious about the level of innovation, the quality of people that was drawn into a political campaign compared to a company. And was there anything that you learned through that experience that actually helped you think about who earns what and kind of fits into what's valuable and what motivates people?
I mean, just to set the scene, this chapter of my career, up until really the one I'm in now, was actually my favorite. I left Facebook in early 2007. Initially, I took a leave. I did not experience Facebook with the same kind of missionary zeal that Mark did. I found it to be challenging, fascinating, interesting, but I knew it wasn't going to be my lifelong mission to work on. And going into the 2008 election, there were all kinds of challenges. With George W. Bush had been president for 8 years, and I felt a sense of responsibility to be part of the change. I went to Chicago to go work for Obama, and everybody then thought we were nuts. It was a crowded primary, taking on Hillary Clinton and John Edwards. It's hard to think about it now when you look back on it, but it's an African-American senator, only had been in for a couple years, middle name of Hussein. It was really, the deck was like, we were a little crazy. And that's what. So when you ask about the kinds of people who were there, it was the kinds of people who were really true believers in him, in the opportunity, and maybe more importantly, in the hope that the impossible, the crazy, could become real. And it was very experimental. because at that point we weren't we weren't building a leading campaign. It was okay to take, in fact, we were there to take risks. It was just it was a very generative kind of environment. So one of the things that happened though early on is because we built a platform that invested in the activists, in a decentralized network of activists. I mean, Facebook, remember, is 3 years old at this point. It's just opened up to the world. Everybody's using MySpace. Twitter doesn't exist. Friendster's like crashing all the time. But there's something percolating, right? Like people are using the social web in an early moment of it, but it's definitely not an established, nothing like it is today. So we built a network and we enabled people to say whatever they wanted, to connect with whoever they wanted, to go to whatever, to create events. And that is not the way political campaigns have really ever been run. They're much more, controlled message, lock it down. And so it changed the whole trajectory. We ended up, raising a ton of money early on, and that got all the people in the institutions of power paying attention. There were thousands, later tens of thousands of events, 1 million people on the social network, phone calls, door knocks. Everything that we were trying to do was take this wave of energy that was coming out of the woodwork, much of which was online, and then turn it into things that actually help people win campaigns. And man, let me tell you, that last part was incredibly difficult. Because it was easy to talk about how great Barack Obama is, but knocking on doors, making phone calls, raising money, holding grassroots events, that was the biggest challenge for me, and I would say for many of us, ended up being a human one, not a technological one.
Really interesting. Let's march along here as we kind of move towards your book. But New Republic. We're in New York, big media thing here. But one of the things about the New Republic, which I thought was interesting, is it's not just media. It was essentially media about big ideas, about intelligentsia, about the idea space. And you've just been in a super innovative tech space. You've been in a super innovative political space. And you tried to bring that, it seems like, is the same kind of innovation and mindset into this space and ran into some problems. And without getting too stuck in the whole thing, I'm just curious, what did you learn in that phase about the openness to change or the innovation space or maybe the limits, essentially, of innovation in certain sectors as we're moving towards policy, for example?
Well, I mean, I'd love to spend a good chunk of time on this because I think we tend to...
We're in New York.
Well, we tend to always celebrate the successes, right? Like Facebook, amazing, Barack Obama's president. Obviously, that's something I'm very proud of. And the New Republic was really the first major setback in my own career. They always say you learn more from your failures than your successes, and I don't know if that's always true, but I certainly learned an immense amount from that period. So, following Facebook's IPO. We came into a lot of money. And one of the things that I'd always really believed in was the power of long-form journalism to shape hearts and minds. To really, our politics is so complex these days, and there's so many different ways that ideas percolate, but there's really, there is still an immense power in the in-depth long-form pieces on the things that matter. It may not be that millions of people read them, but a lot of people read them, and many very influential and powerful people do. So I had always believed in that kind of journalism, and it had spent a long time reading things like the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, etc. And the New Republic was losing lots of money, had been for a very long time. It was nearly 100 years old, and I saw an opportunity. So I bought it in 2012 with the mission of taking the good quality stuff, the long form journalism that I loved and so many other people did, and bring it to new audiences. So specifically using the web, phones, tablets, etc., to adopt new digital storytelling techniques. So everything from interactive graphics to videos to audio pieces of every single one of our pieces, in-person events like this one. I mean, you go through the list, and we really wanted to make it a sustainable business. I really wanted to make it a sustainable business because I believed that it needed to be sustainable or profitable in order to be able to reach these bigger and bigger audiences. So what I learned, though, over the course of the experience was that the millions, tens of millions of people that I wanted to love the journalism that we did, the New Republic had always been a kind of magazine for a relatively small niche audience. I mean, the total number of subscribers, this is a print magazine, the total number of subscribers was 35,000. And I thought we could improve that a little bit, but symbolically it was because the heritage was very specific. You have to be politically minded, culturally curious, have a literary sensibility, and want to read this kind of stuff. So I learned that the audience wasn't as large as I'd hoped, and also that this was not going to be a sustainable enterprise, that the New Republic had lost money for decades. In some ways, I always say that I was like the last person to figure this out. Everybody else already knew it, but it had lost money for decades, and that's not to say that there weren't opportunities to manage the business better, but it really was a cause, a mission dressed up as a company. And so, the differences that I had over building a bigger audience and thinking of it as a business caused many of the journalists that I worked with to leave, and in somewhat dramatic fashion. And that was a turning point for me, because for the following time that I owned it, I thought a lot about what it really was, not what I wanted it to be. So I ended up, once I came to those realizations, I ended up passing the baton to a steward, and the offices are just down a few blocks from here, to Win McCormick, who owns and runs it now, and turned my attention to some of the other work that I'd already been doing on cash transfers, but that became much about the basic income.
Well, before we just move to that, which is what we really got to what we want to talk about, just one thing about this, and it's a complicated thing. I mean, I've kind of been on the East Coast, schooled out here, spent the last 25 years on the West Coast. Was there something about the mentality of the scene, because it kind of gets into policy ideas space, that was resistant to kind of some forms of innovation, or because it's going to have a lot to do with how do we radically change public policy going forward. And I'm just curious if there's a different kind of problem you run into when you start wrestling with social policy, big ideas, and the kind of intelligentsia, essentially, that essentially has very deep roots in a certain way of doing things.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think two things. I think one, the coasts really do speak different languages. I mean, the languages of innovation that you used several times in introducing me in this event, I mean, is more a kind of language I hear more out on the West Coast than here. And I think there was definitely a suspicion on the part of many of the people at the New Republic that any language of innovation and change, that's something to be wary of, not to be hopeful about. Now that's a broad brush. There were many people who wouldn't fit that, but I think that was the general disposition. And I think secondly, particularly what's going on now, it's in some ways, that kind of disposition was probably ahead of its time, and not altogether misplaced. I mean, the questions that we have around the role of these tech companies in our lives now, I think the ones that we're asking and the responses that are coming out are overdue. And I think that those conversations, were percolating back in, let's see, that was 2014 when all this drama happened. But I think there was the beginnings of a sense that just because all things innovative are not good. Yeah. And I personally also believe that, but I think I failed to communicate that with the level of nuance that I felt at the time, and certainly still feel now.
Totally hear it. For those of you who were with us from the beginning of this series, we had Stephen Johnson describing the different innovation cultures of the two coasts in our first What's Now, basically, last fall that launched. Okay, let's go down this journey of the guaranteed basic income. You talk about in your book is Kenya. your trip to Kenya started to open your mind differently about it. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what it started, but talk a little bit about how you saw this idea a little differently by going abroad and then thinking about how you might bring it back, because it's an interesting little story.
So before I go there, can I just get like a raise of hands? If you've heard of UBI or know what it is before, can you just raise your hand so I just have a sense of familiarity? Okay.
Universal basic income, yep, okay.
Yeah, so let me tell you the way I came to the issue. So it's 2012, 2011, 2012, Facebook's around going, the time when it goes public. We come into all this wealth, and my husband and I make a commitment. Okay, we're going to give away the vast majority of this wealth in our lifetimes. There are no shortage of causes that we wanted to give to. I mean, if you think run the thought experiment for a second, if you came into this amount of money, what would you do? Well, you'd probably have a list of 10 different things you'd want to explore. And we found two things. One, there were more causes. For every cause that we thought that we believed in, there were two more that were equally as important. But secondly, it was difficult for us to develop the criteria to evaluate, to compare apples to oranges, or across these different categories. So we started doing some giving, but we also started on the journey of evaluating what is the most impactful thing we can do with each dollar given. So I started from the perspective of international poverty, particularly people who live on less than $1 or $2 a day. And I took a journey to Africa, which is a whole chapter in the book. I narrate it, and I took several journeys to Africa. One of them, I went and toured a lot of these traditional nonprofits, and we went to this village on the Kenya-Somali border. So I went with Jeff Sachs, who's a pretty famous development economist. And the idea was there were a dozen villages called Millennium Villages, and they were going to demonstrate the power of international aid to lift people out of poverty. And we go, and we have this caravan of Land Rovers. There's all these people from his office, from the UN, all these people. And we go for this tour of these villages, and at first we start walking around, everything's fine, and then we go into the dormitories, which have recently been built by UNESCO, and you start looking around, and technically we weren't supposed to go inside, but I was feeling sort of nauseous. It was really hot, so I just sort of went inside. And you start looking around, and you're like, oh, it's not, okay, there's a lot of bunks. It's like, where's all this stuff? Like, I know these kids are poor, but there was literally no stuff, like clothes or pencils or, anything. You're like, okay, that's a little weird. So when we came back outside, and then I saddled up to the tour guide, I was like, where's the stuff? And he was like, oh, we cleaned it before you got here. I was like, all right. It's really clean. So then we were walking to the health clinic. Really nice health clinic. It also was spick and span. It looked like no one had ever used it. And it had all of these supplies, but it also looked almost like it had been set up. Then we went to the classroom, and there was a computer, and the whole tour stopped, right? Because I was there. They were like intent on showing me the internet. They had it, and it was changing lives. And so I was like, oh, that's so great. Facebook, exactly. And I was like, so what do you use it for? I asked the teacher. Everything. Oh, okay, like what kind of stuff? And because it's behind this grill and it's padlocked and it's, it's like, okay, are you guys really using it? And it would have had to have been satellite internet. Ericsson had built a tower, but even through the tower, this was 2010. Anyway, we use it for everything. And then we pushed a little bit harder, and there was no specificity to it. So I left the village with questions. Long story short, journalists went later, and a woman called Nina Monk, who's a journalist for Vanity Fair, she wrote a whole book on it. Those computers had never been used, and they were stolen recently afterward. And the whole village there was effectively, almost like a Potemkin village. Not to say that there weren't a lot of smart people, and certainly a lot of money being invested to make it successful, but for all of the smart people and for all the good intentions, there was this idea that progress could just be engineered from the top down, from Nairobi, from New York, from wherever else. And while a couple of the villages did okay, this particular village was shut down, the one that I went to, and some of the other, and there were a lot of questions around impact in the years afterward. So you compared that to a very different trip I took a few years later, and which was with the group Give Directly. And for those of you who don't know them, I became very skeptical about a lot of the nonprofit interventions. There were several blog posts on a website called GiveWell about, well, what would happen if you just gave poor people money? Do we know? I was like, oh, okay, I don't know. Well, what would it was like one of those things where you read it and then for weeks and then on months you keep thinking about, why do I trust all of these elites and experts rather than the poor? I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's right. So I went to on a very different trip to Give Directly, met with a lot of the people who they were serving, and then was exposed to a vast body of empirical evidence, which shows very conclusively, hundreds of studies internationally, that dollar for dollar, cash is the most effective intervention to lift health outcomes, to lift education outcomes, and to provide economic opportunity. It's not a silver bullet. It is the most effective intervention, I believe, internationally and domestically. So I originally came to the idea of cash through an efficiency lens, like what can I do that's most efficient internationally, and then over time began to look at the United States. Could the same thing be true here? How might these things also work? So I began doing philanthropy internationally, and then about 3 years ago, turned my attention to the changing nature of work and everything happening here with the question of, just because we have this data from Kenya and Finland and Canada, could it actually be relevant here?
Now, it looked like folks did have a familiarity, or quite a few folks on UBI, but not all, and also there's a lot of things to learn here. There's a long history on the left, particularly with Martin Luther King, that it's just worth describing, and then we'll get to the actual interesting history on the conservative side too. But to talk a little bit about the kind of untold legacy, or the not as fully understood legacy of Martin Luther King and the kind of cash payments.
There's really for hundreds of years, but definitely for decades, a lot of philosophers and economists from very different perspectives have coalesced around the idea of using cash to provide an income floor for everybody. And Thomas Paine wrote about it a couple hundred years ago. Martin Luther King Jr. made the case from a philosophical and political perspective that nothing recognizes the dignity of the individual like cash. In the fungibility of cash, it specifically says you decide what you want to do with your time, what you want to do with your resources. So it was a major idea, particularly in the last few years of King's life and the march toward equality in that period. At the same time, it was percolating because economists loved it, because it's efficient. Because specifically, you can say if you're providing cash, you know the benefit gets to the recipient, and you're not paying the overhead, let's call it, of administrators, of building a vast bureaucracy. So Milton Friedman, Hayek, like a lot of folks on the right were very interested in it. So this may be anticipating a little bit where you might want to go, but the idea ended up really reaching a high point in the late 60s, early 70s, and Richard Nixon favored it. The idea passed the House of Representatives, failed in the Senate. But we got very close to establishing financial security for every American through cash. And then we lost it. And now, nearly 50 years later, I think, hopefully, the movement is building again. It's at least percolating a little bit. And now we have a new responsibility, I think, to recognize both the moral and practical case behind it.
Okay, why don't you make the case? And make the case, there's a distinction here. Because actually, I've been in the Valley for a long time, and I've been seeing this, particularly as the rise of AI and automation. There's a lot of talk in the Valley about this, and I've been open to it. I'm always open to new ideas, and I've been, but I haven't really been a real believer. And I must say, your book made me really. It's a compelling argument that really made a very impact on me, and made me think this is the right way to kind of deal with fundamental inequality. But one of the things I want to make that's clear is everyone said universal basic income. He makes that actual argument of guaranteed basic income. And I think it's really an important distinction. And why don't you explain what that is?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, the idea of universal basic income, these days in particular, is really talked about often in response to the rise of the robots and this worry of mass technological unemployment. That automation and/or artificial intelligence are going to destroy so many jobs that we need to provide income security as a kind of insurance policy to everyone. That is a robust debate that is raging. And it's amazing, talk about coastal differences. Out in Silicon Valley, at least amongst the people I talk to, that is just like old hat. Of course that's going to happen. You go to Washington, that is absolutely crazy. Truly.
The idea about AI and robotics?
Yeah, no, the idea that AI is going to massively displace jobs. The economists will say, yeah, there might be some short-term issues, but in the long term, we know what happened in the Luddite uprising. There were jobs that were created elsewhere, and the economy kept rolling, and there's no reason to believe this time is different. So while this debate rages, my perspective is we don't need to declare a winner to know that we need a guaranteed income today. Jobs in America, for the most part, have already come apart and are quickly unraveling. So by that I mean, yeah, the unemployment rate is at near record lows, and stock market's at near record highs, but all these jobs that we're creating, literally 94% of the jobs that we've created in the past decade are part-time, contract, temporary, seasonal. We call them the gig economy, but it's not just like Lyft drivers and Postmates delivery people. It's folks who can only get 20 hours or 25 hours at Starbucks this week, and they have no idea if they're going to get 10 or 40 next week. It's up to the scheduling manager. So these jobs have become the norm. Very few of them offer vacation days, paid sick leave, paid leave of any sort, certainly not retirement benefits, all the things that used to come with a job. So work is becoming increasingly precarious because of technology, because of globalization, because of the rise of finance, because of multiple trends, not just the technical ones. And my view on this is that a guaranteed income not only responds to the income inequality that's at record levels, but this idea of the income instability. 1 month you're great, next month you don't know if you're going to be able to make rent. And the stress that introduces, there's a fantastic book on this called Scarcity. I should probably not. Well, I'm going to recommend a lot of other books besides my own. But there's Scarcity is a fantastic book. So there's two I'll actually recommend on this topic of the actual cognitive effects that exist when you don't know if you're going to be able to make rent. There are many studies on this, and they're really eye-opening. Also, another book called The Financial Diaries, which really chronicles this problem of instability and why that is as problematic as inequality. So let me get to the idea is to stabilize the lives of everyone in the United States of America who's currently experiencing this instability and create a down payment for a perhaps even bigger, larger idea of a kind of universal basic income in time. So specifically in the book, I argue for beginning with $500 a month to every adult who makes $50,000 or less, who's doing something for their family, for their community, in the formal economy, informal economy, but to provide a layer of income stability so that people can make ends meet. And lest you think this is like an absolutely crazy idea, we already have the world's largest cash transfer program. It's administered through the tax code. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. The challenge for us is we got to make it bigger, make it monthly, have it recognize untraditional kind of work, And if we can do that, then we will have built not the UBI for the long term, but we will have made a solid down payment on a guaranteed income for working people. And I think it's similar to things like Social Security and other things where we start with this, and then over time, we have the opportunity to expand it and grow it.
And you're talking, we're going to get to the conversation here shortly, so think about kind of questions and your own perspectives on this. But one big piece of your idea, which gets directly at the inequality issue, is the flip side of how to fund it. And let's talk about that, because I think at heart, we've watched, it starts to deal with the other side of the equation, of just outside returns, income coming at the other end. And so talk about how you think it could be funded and the size of what we'd have to raise through these measures.
Well, those of you who know a little something about this know that there are a lot of ways to pay for this. So the cost that we're looking at for what I lay out is about $300 billion, which is a very significant sum. There are some people who think that I'm too conservative, but $300 billion is half of what we spend on defense now. It would make it the fourth largest social program after Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So this is really a significant amount of money, and I don't want to sidestep the seriousness of it. It is, however, eminently affordable. I think that taxes on income above $250,000, not up to, but above $250,000, should be restored to where they were for much of the 20th century at 50%. So they're about 35% now. And in addition to that, we should close the most egregious tax loopholes that particularly wealthy people are able to take advantage of now. If we do those two things, we can pay for a guaranteed income that would wipe 20 million people out of poverty overnight, lift them out of poverty, and stabilize the lives of nearly 100 million, 90 million Americans, poor Americans and lower middle class. And I truly believe that it is not a matter of penalties for the rich, but asking the most fortunate, the winners in the economy, to pay their share. I think in the long run, it will be good for them, just like it'll be good for the poor and the middle class, because we know that consumer spending drives economic growth, and the more money that's in the pockets of middle class and poor people, it's going to get spent in the productive economy. That's going to grow the economy in turn. I mean, that is that there's immense amounts of evidence that shows if we had a guaranteed income of $500 a month, it would boost GDP by nearly a point. So my view on it is that it is affordable if we ask people who have done extremely well to pay their share. And for those people who think, to get a sense of how much we're talking about here, if you make 300 grand, or your family makes 300 grand, there are some people in New York or San Francisco who would say, well, that's not, that's a lot of money, but that's not, crazy tech billionaire kind of money. Those folks would pay an additional $7,000 a year to fund this. The people who make $10 million a year, the ultra wealthy, would be paying significantly more, over $1.5 million more dollars each year to fund this. So the ultimate share really does rest on the shoulders of the winners in the winner-take-all economy that we live in.
Well, maybe to kind of round that out just before we roll into conversation here is, as a co-founder of Facebook and in and out of San Francisco and California and all, as well as here in Manhattan with a lot of elite, how do you think that would go over, honestly? I mean, not immediately you say, oh, no one wants to get taxed, but do you really think, what do you think the prospects are? Because I think given the tech backlash, given the kind of, political populism that's kind of breaking out all over the world, do you think this is a time that could really make it work?
I think the first thing we have to do is demonstrate that it'd be money well spent. I think nobody wants to just pay more taxes for paying more taxes, even if it's for, even if it has good intentions. People want to know their money's going to be well spent. So I think that the first thing is to build a case. And that's well before, we're talking about the long-term government policy here, but we're running a demonstration in Stockton, California, which I would love to invite more people to be more involved in to make the case. We are running, developing, the Economic Security Project, the group I co-run, along with some other folks, are developing more research to prove that this is effective. Can make the case at a state level. So I think the first thing that we have to do is not say, well, you should just pay more taxes because you should pay more taxes. The first thing we have to do is make the case that cash is the most efficient and effective way to provide economic mobility, and it's very, very doable. I think if we do that, we are not going to win over everybody in the winner-take-all kind of world. I do think we win over a lot of them, because the people that I talk to, at least, have this. There's this permeating sense that people are getting who are getting very, very lucky owe a lot, and they don't. Many of them give back to nonprofits and things, but it still feels like something is structurally making their success possible at the same time that median wages have not budged in 40 years. So I do think that in the long term, we can make the case in a way that some, maybe most, will be supportive of. And I frankly, at the same time, hope that many of the people that I talk to who are not part of the 1% can develop the political power to make this what I view, and I think many others also view, as a more fair economic policy, the law of the land.
For what it's worth, as someone who has literally been out for the last 20-some years out in the Bay Area and in that whole tech scene, I think the tech world is totally ripe for this kind of thing. I don't think...
You do? You think,
yes,
there's a... Right.
I think it's like, and in fact, in California, I don't know how it's actually playing out in New York here, but California's been consistently raising taxes on wealthy folks, and there's been no big backlash. There's been no pouring out of the country, out of the state, and in fact, everyone's like, great, bring it on if we're going to do things productively with it. But that's another conversation about California politics. But this is a good time to turn over. We've been talking here. It's been a great laying out your story, the case. There's also some really interesting characters here in this room who might have some also thoughts and could build on it or have questions for it, or let's open it up in here. And here's the deal. We're live streaming this with a 3-camera shoot. So Lori here has got to get you the mic and stand up and just kind of identify yourself a little bit, just to situate how you might fit in this whole thing, conversation, or just where you're from, and ask a question or make a comment. Okay, no, just stand up right here, and Lori will run it up there. There's also, if there's, as you're waiting for that, if there's folks in the back room, because there's overflow, we jammed out everything here, you guys can also ask a question, and there's someone back there for Capgemini who can help you figure out how to do that. But go ahead, let's hear it.
Hi there, my name's Emelina. I work with arts and arts businesses to become a little bit more entrepreneurial savvy. And my question to you is, are you familiar or aligned at all with conscious capitalism? And the reason why I ask is because you haven't addressed, and I'm eager to read the book, but you haven't addressed yet in this conversation about the systematic problems that created this inequality to begin with, which in theory would still be there even if we do make the levels more even. But if the systematic things are still there, then who's to say that it won't just be a different problem with the same ilk?
Absolutely.
Good question.
We're going to do one question at a time, right?
Yeah, it's a conversation now with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a key, I think a lot of folks, particularly in the community that I work in, sometimes we run the risk of making the case that cash or guaranteed income, UBI, is going to be a silver bullet, is going to do it. And I do not think that. I think that there are major structural kinds of reforms in the economy that need to happen. And I also think that we have to have good schools, a healthcare system that works much better than the one we have now. I mean, if we don't get our climate policy right, then none of this is going to matter in a sense in the long term. So I do think that it's important not to overlook some of the simplest and most efficient solutions. And that's why I really do work on cash every day, is because I do think that there is a moral dimension to it, that people need, that cash provides freedom in a way that is more direct, unlike anything else. Now, if you don't have affordable housing to choose between, or you don't have a subway to get you to a job, then you're not free. It's not, again, it's not like cash is freedom. It's just that it recognizes and enables that incredibly effectively, and needs to happen in addition to these other kinds of solutions. So I want to say another thing, just on the conscious capitalism point. It's so interesting. The book came out 3 weeks ago, and some people I talk to think that this idea is just like the most socialist of ideas ever. People are like, "So you're really just a communist, right?" And other people more on the left view this as a very capitalistic idea, because it's market oriented. It's the idea that you invest in the market, and it's a little bit more of the approach of like, well, if you don't pay attention to all these other structural reforms, then it won't work. For me, this is a way of creating a capitalism that works for everyone, a kind of system that puts guardrails on it, like we had for much of the 20th century. We just haven't had for the past 20 or 30 years, that creates broad-based prosperity, the kind where median wages increase consistently over time, and not just this immense concentration in the hands of a small few. So I really do feel that it's a way of beginning a conversation about structural changes to the current economic system, and it's not the only one, but I do think it is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, structural things we can do.
Okay, so I'm just looking. Put your hands up if you guys have questions, because I got to juggle it a little bit. But we're going to go to this one here. Stand up and identify yourself.
Hi, Gabriella Mirabelli. I work with entertainment and media companies to help them market and promote their content. I'm interested in the cultural aspect of this, because in our country, obviously, with the recent election, there was a real cultural shift, and the ACA was starting to move in a way that would support this. And obviously, there are a lot of people who culturally, even if they need support and basic income, that's challenging to accept, and there's a lot of judgment that goes along with that. And so hand in glove with providing the income, there would need to be a pretty profound cultural change for the recipients. I mean, certainly in the Pennsylvania election, I mean, the deep Republican that just flipped to Lamb, that population would benefit, and yet would often seem to reject.
Yeah.
Good question.
Well, this is one I'm anxious. I want to answer, but I also want to turn this one back on you and all of you, because this is a question that I think is one that I worry about a lot of the time. I think the question in the way that I think about it is, how do we make the moral case for cash, is the way that I say it. Because I do really strongly believe we have the empirical case. We need some more data, and we have more demonstrations and pilots and research to do. So it's not like asked and answered, but we have every reason to believe that that people, we know when you give them money, they don't spend it on, booze and cigarettes and, all of these kinds of consumption goods. They invest it in themselves and their families. They work. After you give people money, they work just as much as they did before, if not, in some cases, a little bit more, education outcomes or health outcomes. But people don't always listen to data. If you give it, say it again.
The mythology.
Exactly. The mythology is, you give it to 100 people, there's no doubt, like 1 or 2 of those people are not going to use it that way. And then you've got 1 or 2 people who throw the whole thing into question. So I do think that the way to make the moral case for it today is that, did any of you guys read Strangers in Their Own Land? Arlie Hochschildt's book has another book everybody should read if you haven't read it. It's this idea that everybody feels that they're standing in line, and the line is not moving. Not everybody, but many of the voters that you're talking about. And I think the case that we have to make is that the line needs to begin moving for everybody. As long as you are doing something for your family or your community, or you're in part of the formal workforce, which is effectively everyone, outside of the disabled and the elderly, which I can talk about the existing safety net. But for the vast majority of working age Americans, as long as you're doing something for your family, your community, or working in the formal economy, you should not live in poverty. That's like one of those ideas that when you poll on it, it's like, it sounds sort of like a cliche, and it's because like everybody, just about everybody on both sides of the aisle agrees with it. So I do think that has to be the foundation of the case that we make. And then we still have the challenge of like, okay, if you agree with that, cash is the most efficient way to do it. I think we do live in a time of deep cynicism about government in general, and so that probably part of the reason, along with artificial intelligence and automation, that this conversation is percolating, because this is not a solution that invests in government administrators. This is a solution that invests in, in people. And so I'm somewhat hopeful that we can use these ideas that most people agree with as a springboard to make the case. But I think I'm really curious what other people think, because this is our challenge. If we're going to be the generation that wipes out poverty, we have to think about how we talk about it in a way that welcomes everyone in over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Let's go here, and then we're going to go back to the top there, and then we'll get to you.
Michael Smolens.sub. I have a technology platform enabling video to be in other languages. So we have Macron in Paris, Trudeau, someone in Pennsylvania, all in the 30s that are elected. So you're talking about a sort of a business philosophical change that has a lot of intellectual, legs to it. Have you thought about going into politics? You were working with
Not me.
No. That's not part of your.
No.
But
no.
would it, if you could get this to be piggybacked with an Obama
yes.
candidate and have
Yes.
this to, because I don't think without political force at the top, it could get passed.
Yeah, I mean, this is where we need the help of every single person in this room. And it's not just, yes, for like the Elizabeth Warrens and the Bernie Sanders and the folks who are exposed to the idea, who are interested in the idea, we need to provoke here and make sure that they're paying attention to the data. I do think that many of them look at the data and look at the empirical analysis. We need to make the case there. But up and down, all across civil society, I think we need to make the case to city council people in New York City. Why shouldn't we be doing a guaranteed income demonstration here? Or the mayor of Tulsa or New Haven or Stockton or San Francisco? Why shouldn't we be thinking about like what are the baby steps to get something like this started? I think the challenge, the reason that there a lot of them I think are not there yet is because there have been big questions about how do you actually get this done? How does the policy look? And we're working with a lot of think tanks like the Roosevelt Institute, parts of the Urban Institute to spend the next year putting out a lot of different ideas for the approaches. And just on that for 1 second, there are other approaches that are very viable that aren't the earned income tax credit. I just want to name two of them really briefly because I think it's important. One is the idea of taxing carbon and distributing all the revenue that comes from that as a dividend to everybody. This is modeled on what they do up in Alaska, where they tax oil royalties, and every Alaskan gets $1,500. If you have a family of 4, every October you get $6,000. Median income is above $60,000. So like imagine your paycheck getting boosted by 10% every October, no strings attached. So that's another viable model. Another viable model is to think carefully about potentially creating these sovereign wealth funds, these kinds of the kinds of things that the oil-rich countries in the Middle East or in Norway or wherever, they create these funds, and you could capitalize them with all kinds of different assets. I mean, there are many, many options. And then you have them grow over the next 10 or 20 years, and as they grow and get the benefit of all the market gains, which everybody else hasn't been sharing in, they can begin to spit out dividends too. And then there are still more ideas here. So I guess my point is I would love to move into a presidential cycle where we're having, these are the fault lines of the debate. One person wants a modernized EITC, another wants a carbon dividend. That's the kind of, and we need a lot more cities experimenting, a lot more nonprofits doing work to get us there.
Guy in the back here.
Hello, so I'm Salah Azizi, work here at Capgemini. So I come from France, as you could have guessed by the accent. I followed the last political election from the French presidential election. One candidate lost at the primary cycle. He focused his entire program on universal basic income. The thing is, and one of the pushbacks that we have a lot of in France is there is this minimum insertion revenue that is
RSA.
already in and people say, well, you just give people, I mean, $400, $500 euros a month, and they just stay at home. They don't bring the economy further. So this is the pushback that we heard a lot during the election, and all the time when you talk to people. What is the main argument that you have in front of that, and what is the thing that we could put back there and that could make in the next political election the UBI program work?
I think on this, this is a place where France and the U.S. share some things in common. There's a trust deficit, and also I think a narrowness of recognition of what counts as real work. This is something that I spend a good bit of time on in the book, and if you think that people staying at home taking care of young kids are not doing work, then I have one 3-month-old, and man, I thought this beforehand, but now I'm like, no, that's work. And if you're taking care of elderly people, particularly dependents over 70, who the numbers of people in their prime or working age who are dropping out of the workforce because they have aging parents for whom it's much cheaper for the caregiver to leave work to take care of them at home than to put them in a nursing home. That is also work. If you're a student, my view is if you're enrolled in a college or a university, you are doing work. I mean, right now, millions of students have guaranteed incomes. They just come from their parents. And then there's everybody else, and my kid will be one of them in that category, but I was in the financial aid category where, doing work study, and that is how a lot of these structural, not just structural class barriers, but I think also where it intersects with many of the racial barriers, this is how they get passed down over time, because the folks who don't have to work get more time to study, get more time to do what they want, get more time to experiment and say, hey, I'll drop out of school for a semester and do Facebook. Well, it won't be any big deal. I can just go back. I don't have to work for that semester. My parent, it'll be fine. And then, that equity portion is significant. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is I think that another cultural challenge, perhaps in France, although certainly here, is to broaden the definition of work and expand it to recognize what work really is, including a lot of untraditional, unpaid work. And my view is that encompasses almost every American. And for those that it doesn't, the disabled, elderly, et cetera, that is what the safety net is for. I mean, we do have Social Security disability insurance. It needs to be bigger and better. I mean, that is what Social Security is for. And the social safety net, I don't believe, should fund any of the guaranteed income. It should sit on top of it in order to make sure that that both of these groups are supported. And it doesn't speak narrowly to French politics, but you might know probably be able to weigh in more
afterwards
thoroughly
there's
on
going to
that.
be more drinks and food, and you can figure that out. Would you stand up though and identify yourself? Other folks, okay, I see. Yeah.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jeremiah Drake. I'm with the Riverside Church, Mission and Social Justice Commission, and I'm a Theater of the Oppressed practitioner, which is untraditional work. I get a small income from my time in the military. I was a paratrooper, 82nd Airborne Division. So about a month ago, I got the bright idea to start a petition on whitehouse.gov, hoping to create a UBI, a guaranteed basic income for veterans. I'm thinking that my thinking was everyone comes up to you on Veterans Day and say, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. But thank you for your service is not legal tender. It really doesn't help. And it's like Noam Chomsky said, saying to a veteran, saying to any military person, well, I support the troops. He said it's meaningless. It's like saying you support dairy farmers in Wisconsin. It's meaningless. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do a UBI petition, whitehouse.gov. If you get 100,000 signatures in 30 days, you're guaranteed a response from the White House. So it's been like 20 days, and I think I have 20 signatures.
We're going to get you 20 more at least.
I know. And I put it on Facebook. And then I saw what you were doing. My friend up here, she sent me the notification and invited me. But I also saw it on Facebook, and I said, geez, I've got to come here and see if I can listen to what you have to say. But talk about income inequality as well. You know, as I said, I'm a Theater of the Oppressed practitioner. Theater of the Oppressed is a participatory art form. I've been doing it for, 25 years. I'm one of the leading practitioners of this art form that's all over the world right now. I work with Columbia University, Pratt Institute, and I also work with farm workers. Now, income inequality. This morning I was working, me and my wife, we worked with 30, 40 Mexican children, young kids whose parents are up here protesting, Wendy's treatment of farm workers, people who feed us all. Farm workers feed us all. Some of the food out here, all the food out here, it went through the hands of farm workers. So these kids' parents are up here in New York City from Immokalee, Florida, trying to get Wendy's to sign on to the Fair Food Agreement, which they refused to do. So I'm here this morning working with poor, children of farm workers, and then I'm here in the evening. I just take a 4 train down and I'm right here. So that's a very stark, example of inequality, income inequality. So yeah. I agree that it does take missionary zeal, and I guess I really didn't have a pointed question for you.
Well, your experience,
Yeah, exactly, the experience. As I said, I live on less than $800 a month. Now that I've gotten married, that's improved, thank God, because she doesn't have an untraditional job. There's nowhere you can go to get a job. You can't sign up somewhere to get a job. You can't apply for a job in this form of theater.
Well, this is a good example of. Well, thanks for that.
But
input,
it's very worthwhile work. Now, my question is, would you be willing to consider coming to Riverside Churches, where Dr. King gave his Beyond Vietnam speech? I've been there 20 some odd years at the church as well. So would you consider
to talk afterward? Absolutely. I live in New
Excellent.
York.
Thank you. So I just want to thank you for your efforts for UBI, because I also believe that it's the best way. I can tell you, I wouldn't. If I had something like that, I can guarantee you, myself and other veterans and other non-vets who are citizens too, would not waste it. So thank you for your efforts.
I'd love to get your card afterwards.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
You had a question here. Do you want to? But thanks for that contribution. Let's get a quick here, and then any other hands here? I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get it all figured out. Okay.
We can take comments too. The more it is a discussion, the better.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So my name is I.S. Dunklin. I'm a tech media and telecom consultant right now. But was wondering, we've talked about the UBI as layering on top of the existing safety net, and wonder where you see that going kind of in the longer term. Is there opportunity to increase the efficiency of some of our existing safety net programs through cash transfers, or transition some of those programs over? Do you see anything along those lines as an opportunity?
I think we have to be careful. I think we have to create, I think we all want to live in a country where we have a culture of honestness about what's working and what doesn't work. And right now, I hear a lot of screaming and debating on the way things should be or not should be, but not a lot of referring to, data and assessments to evaluate. Really, I think that's the time that we live in. So I think we have to create a culture that is honest about what in our safety net is working and isn't working. I also do think, though, we have to be very careful before we start cashing stuff in. There are people in the guaranteed income community who, this is a point of spirited debate. My view is that the safety net is pretty thin now, pretty, full of all kinds of holes. Unfortunately, at times it does force a lot of people living in poverty to spend their days running from one government office to another to prove that they interviewed here or are still this poor. I mean, I was in Jackson, Mississippi 3 weeks ago talking to these single moms living in public housing who have kids, some of whom were working, some of whom weren't working. Half of them weren't working because they had to spend every day taking the bus to go prove that they had less than $2,000 in a savings account. By the way, half of them don't get savings accounts for fear of going over by $1, being thrown off of those benefits. They can't have their boyfriend move in to have a more serious, to deepen their relationship because they get thrown out of their house, public housing. So we've created all of these complex structures. So there's a real sense that I think those things need to be talked about and evaluated so that they provide more freedom and dignity to the people who are benefiting. But I do not think that the right thing to start with is a cash-in approach. Because at the end of the day, we have more than enough wealth. I mean, we live in the richest country in the world, in the richest time in history. We have more than enough wealth and abundance to pay for this now. And once we've established a guaranteed income and people have that security, then I think we can and should have conversations about how it's working. Is it the right amount? Is $500 too little, too much? Should it be higher? But we have to create a culture where we're having those honest conversations about what's working, what's not working, and how cash can provide that dignity. I think those conversations are in the long run. In the short term, I would layer it on top of what we have now.
Guy up here.
Hello, my name's Zach. I work for a local real estate developer. Thank you for coming here and talking about this very important and timely subject. But I wanted to ask you, one of the developments we've seen alongside the rise in income inequality is massive disparities in the rise of massive disparities in the cost of living in different locations around the country.
Yeah.
So your plan to provide $500 a month across the board to everybody, that's going to make a huge different impact in a low cost of living area versus New York City and San Francisco, where we have higher median incomes as it is here. So would you see any way to address that through your plan in the long term?
Absolutely. I think we have to benchmark it. I'm so glad you brought up the cost of living because that's the short answer is I think we have to benchmark it to the region and probably down to the county, if not even to a more local level. Because as we know, I mean, speaking of Mississippi, median income in Mississippi is $37,000. Median income in the Bay Area or in this neighborhood, in this zip code, is probably several times more than $37,000. So the point is I definitely think we need to benchmark it to the cost of living in any one place. But that phrase, the cost of living, we have done the Group Economic Security Project. We have traveled the country doing informal interviews, just like roundtables like the one in Mississippi. We've also done some public opinion research, sort of traditional focus groups. We've done public polling. Across the board, when you talk to people about what they're struggling with, that is the phrase. I'm working just as hard as I've worked for decades, but I just can't keep up with the cost of living. Well, what specifically? Housing, healthcare, childcare, and education. Those four things. And empirically, all of those things are 30% more expensive than they were 25 years ago. So you hear it anecdotally, it's in the data, it's very clear that the cost of living is in many ways the way that people experience the challenge. And this kind of program, I do think would need to be benchmarked to take into account the cost of living, the different nature of the cost of living challenges in different places.
All right, we got a quick here, and we'll move it around. We don't have a ton more, but yeah, that's good.
Hi, Alfie Rustam. I'm a media and blockchain entrepreneur. And you mentioned cash. Why cash? I mean, if you look at the nature of money and how fiat fractional reserve banking works, there's obviously problems there. And so have you thought about alternative currencies?
Absolutely. No,
This is good.
wait, what's...
Hey, we're innovating. Hey, we're trying to innovate, right?
Wait,
Why
do people
not?
think that's funny because it seems outlandish, or because it seems...
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I'll answer the question. I'm
bet
curious, though, why...
I think that
because that's
is.
the thing. When you start talking about crypto, man, the responses are different in the different rooms. I mean... So, the short answer is yes, and the short answer is we also need to think more. I mean, there are people who are experimenting, with currencies that have a universal basic income built into them, where they distribute cash from the system, to holders of the currency in regular periods in order to make sure that everybody has a basic income. The questions are, there's so many people thinking about that in my world. I'm very focused on the here and now and today. And making the jump, I think, is something that I want like ESP and other people to invest in, thinking about how that actually might work. Because I worry about the kinds of women I was just talking about who are literally unbanked. You know, I mean, before you even get to crypto or even something like just Bitcoin. I asked the women in this group, have any of you guys ever heard of Bitcoin? It was at the end of the session, and they all looked around. One woman goes, like Bitcoin? Like what I get on my feet? I was like, no, not that. Like Bitcoin, like the currency. And they were all like, no, I've not heard of that. You know, it was there's. I mean, and it's a funny anecdote, but I think the reality is so many times we talk about these new innovations, and I and many other people get very excited about them, but they don't, by their nature, deliver the prosperity evenly, particularly to the people who need it most. So I think that's the challenge in the cryptocurrency conversation is how is it possible to make sure that the poorest of the poor in America are not left behind by all these cool innovations that leaders in Silicon Valley and in New York and elsewhere are charging forward on. So again, if there are people who are working on this or interested in this, I'd love to talk to you more because this is in the list of like major research questions that we have to think through.
I'm James. I'm working on open source robotically-made furniture. And my question is, do you see kind of an Airbnb or potential Airbnb-like reaction where if you give $500 to everyone in Brooklyn, the landlords will just raise the rent by $500, and then that would require structural changes to kind of fix that? What do you think of the Star Trek cashless society where you walk into a grocery store, everything's free, same with healthcare, same with every sort of consumer good?
Interesting. Two
The second one is harder for me to imagine. The first is a real concern. If you don't have smart housing policy with that makes it possible for people to have access to affordable housing and all the challenges that go with that, an infrastructure system that makes it possible, then I do worry that a lot of a guaranteed income would get eaten up by in housing costs. There are a lot of the economists look at this and they say, yes, but if there were more liquidity in the system, if you will, people could have more power to move. And right now, one of the issues is, 52% of Americans couldn't find $400 in case of an emergency. So that includes much of the middle class. And the average move over a state line costs $5,000. So there is this, and this, by the way, works for the argument of why don't people in these areas that have been left behind, why don't they just move to areas of economic opportunity? Moving is expensive, not to mention the emotional, personal challenges of it. And similarly on the housing policy, a lot of the economists, talk about how creating more liquidity in the system would run the risk that much of it would be eaten up in housing costs, but assuming that there's additional mobility, that it would enable people to move to places where they could afford the rent better. I personally think that unless we figure out how to have smart housing in New York or San Francisco and other major cities, then it's sort of like climate policy. It just doesn't. None of it's going to make sense. I just think that there are a lot of very smart people working on housing. We need more. There aren't that many people working on cash, and so that's why I end up talking about this and doing this every day.
All right, we're going to get a few more questions, and then we're going to have some more drinks and food and be able to talk amongst ourselves. Go ahead.
Ryan M. Gay, work with a global innovative law firm, so thanks for your time tonight. First question, how did you land on $500 exactly?
Yeah.
And then second question is, you talked about the 20s and certain times back in the past where there's equality, it was more heavily balanced. Have you thought about the effectiveness of UBI, but specifically guaranteed UBI, as a more effective platform, maybe being reintroduced through the second Bill of Rights that failed simply because FDR passed away and didn't get that through? Certainly that, UBI alone, but guaranteed UBI alone at $500 a month is probably not going to impact everyone with health issues or education challenges. And that second Bill of Rights included those other factors. So just thought about it again, having to figure out bringing this into a political platform with a candidate that would be open to introducing something like that.
The $500 is a number that I and a lot of other people have thought quite a lot about. Although there's nothing magical about 500. 500 in particular is the kind of money that is, if you're a family, just to put it in perspective, if you have a family of 4 making minimum wage and you got a guaranteed income of $500 and your spouse did, you'd see your income go up by 40%. So it may not sound like a lot, but if it's, for minimum wage workers and unfortunately for, tens of millions of Americans, the $500 level, is a really meaningful boost. The question to me is how, where do you really start the down payment? Right, because if you talk about FDR, the history of Social Security started somewhat modestly and then was added on to over time. It didn't include agricultural workers, domestic workers. There were it was actually quite racialized the way that it was started. It excluded a lot of people, unfortunately. They got it in place and then they built on it multiple times over the course of really 15 years, and it was Truman that really brought it to full fruition. So my view is the $500 is certainly not enough to solve it. But I mean, you hear about people who are living on $800 a month. It would be a meaningful amount of money, and the top line stats of being able to overnight lift, cut the poverty rate in half, to lift 20 million people out of poverty. Are really some of the most powerful ones. I think over time, we very well could and should increase the amount. But if we're talking about what we can do today, I think $500 is like the right place to start.
Okay, I'm going to take the host's prerogative and going to ask the last question. And what I'd just like to do is, this series is about innovation. And we started with you, in all these innovative spaces. To what extent can you make the argument for this, not so much in a moral case or various ways you've made this, but on a kind of societal innovation or economic innovation or a kind of liberating kind of creative energy kind of space? Is there anything you've learned in this process of what people do with that money that actually makes them try new things or start new businesses or, do things that actually kind of add into the innovative equation? I thought, any thoughts on that? Because it's kind of a nice way to close a series that we're trying to always draw out. Where does innovation come from, and why shouldn't it come from everybody grabbing $500 at at all little nicks and corners of our society?
Yeah, one story which isn't. One of the trips that I took to Africa to Give Directly villages. So Give Directly gives $1,000 to people living on roughly $1, $2 a day, as an infusion, and then people, it's cash, so they can use it for whatever they want. And the way they do it, they take you on a randomized tour, so it's none of this package stuff. you really don't know what you get. It's quite risky for them because you can find all different kinds of people, and unfortunately, it means a lot of people aren't home a lot of the time. So it's like a donor walking through the, eastern Kenya, middle of nowhere. You're just like knocking on like huts and like, where is everybody? They're all working. They're fishing. They're taking care of their kids. They're doing stuff. But it's but on the second trip that I went. I had several conversations with people in huts, and you asked them what they did with the money. And a lot of people did pretty predictable stuff. They switched from thatch roofs to 10. Or they spent it on school fees for their kids. Or one guy bought a motorcycle so he could have like a little taxi service. And then a couple of our colleagues went and they did another walkthrough, and they came back, and one of the guys that they talked to was this young guy who was a total a go-getter in the community. And they were like, so what did you spend the money on? And he was like, well, to be honest, I bought a keyboard. And they were like, okay, why'd you buy a keyboard? And he's like, well, everybody always has these parties on Saturday nights around in the different villages, and they listen to the radios and they hang out. And I figured they need some entertainment. And so now he spent half of the money on the keyboard. So now Saturday nights he goes around, he puts it on his backpack, he gets on a bike, and then he's the local DJ for the party, and he gets paid a little bit and comes back to his hut. The other half, he was like, everybody's always paying. The thing that everybody always wants more of and more of, they can't get enough, is sugar. And I don't really mind bees, so I bought a beehive. What? Everybody else is like moving from thatch to 10, like school fees. He's like, yeah, I bought a beehive. And now, yeah, I get stung some, but I think they know me. I'm like their keeper. And he sells honey with the other half. And this is in the same village where somebody else was given livestock by another nonprofit, and they were like, I don't know what to do with a cow. Like, what do you do with a cow? I've never had a cow because they're not farmers. They're not. So I guess my point is I don't think we should ever underestimate the creativity and the capacity for innovation amongst people, and people of all stripes and all geographies, in all places, certainly here in America, also abroad. And I don't think that there's nothing provides the opportunity for those people to self-actualize and figure out if they want to buy a keyboard, if they want to go back to school, if they want to buy a beehive, whatever it is that they want to do, like money. And I think we should give more people more of it.
And so do I. So let's give a good hand for this huge, incredible story. Incredible story. Folks, more food, more drink, hang out, meet each other. We're going to do a next one in another 4 weeks here. We'll be getting out the invites. Everyone who's here is in. Bring some interesting characters, interesting innovators, and let's grow this network. So thanks again.
Thanks.